военное давление с использованием приемов.
They are getting sucker punched against, so to say. And in their statements, in one way or another, they have to make certain statements, certain claims. They speak about how they adhere to the main principles of the UN Charter. They speak about the territorial integrity. They speak about the respect for sovereignty. We also agree with this. We also support this. But I would like to remind you that the UN Charter, like any document that was adopted by the entire global community, cannot be executed randomly. It's not a menu that you can pick items from. And like I said, in the UN Charter, it is enshrined, and it even concentrates upon this principle, the principle of the right of the peoples to self-determination. And since the very beginning of the UN, its member states paid attention that the principle of the sovereignty and territorial integrity and this principle of the right of the peoples for self-determination, it has to be somehow interpreted, and the process was launched where all the countries participated, which ended with the adoption of the Declaration on the Principles of Interstate Relations based on the United Nations Charter. This document has never refuted, has never cancelled since then, and there the interaction between these two principles is interpreted in the following way. Every state must adhere to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of any other state. It represents the entire nation that lives there. It is obvious that the government does not represent the interests of the people in Crimea or in Donbass. I think everyone understands this perfectly. There is no need to delve into it any further.
From India Today, Minister Lavrov just wanted to know whether if there's going to be a joint communique. Was there a discussion on that? And why did Russia, including China, move back from the Bali Declaration? Also, you mentioned that the G20 forum has become a farce, apologized to India for the behavior of the West. What transpired in that room?
It's an interesting expression. Why Russia, including China? Что касается причин, по которым не состоялось принятие декларации.
As for the reasons why the declaration was not adopted, and instead of this, Indian presidency will outline their vision of the discussion as some kind of a summary by the president. I have just explained it in a lot of detail in your question, why the formula, the same formula that was put into the Bali Declaration. I also touched upon this. The summit on Bali took place more than 6 months ago, and since then a lot of things have happened that show what is going on in Ukraine, including the admission of guilt, basically, of 3 signatories of the Minsk Accords. And via Ms. Merkel, via Mr. Hollande and Mr. Poroshenko, they were directly stating that they were never going to implement these accords. And the accords, I would like to remind you, concerned including the provision of unalienable rights, human rights, in particular the rights of the Russian-speaking population to speak their native language, to teach their children in Russian. All this was not just undermined, but it was banned by law. The decision the Ukrainian parliament adopted, the decrees that the Ukrainian president signed that went for the education in Russia, the media that worked in Russian in regards to the Russian literature and Russian culture on a general level, and many other things. Today on the sidelines, I talked to my Western counterparts. I wanted to draw their attention to this, and they're looking at you without blinking, but they are not saying anything in response. The only position they have, why Russia has allowed the invasion, and they all emphasize that it was unprovoked. This invasion reflects the reaction to the war that the West was preparing for many years, and that's why it was arming the Ukrainian regime. And I would like to remind you that they took power as a result of armed coup d'etat. So the Bali formula, that a thing of the last year, of the past, a lot of things became clearer, not only to us, because we knew about it since long, but to all those who really want to investigate what's going on. Mr. Lavrov, European media published the results of a poll, and it says that the global South sees Russia as a partner and ally, which came as a surprise for the West. When do you think this strict division happened between the countries of the Golden Billion, so to say, and the rest? And isn't it the reason the Western leaders and diplomats are now traveling to, for example, Blinken went to the Central Asia, and Macron went to Africa, Scholz went to India? They go there to convince this country to join the sanctions, or it is a more global matter? If we speak about history, the ancestor of this Golden Billion is the colonial powers that were seizing the territories, conquering the territories on various continents, and they were imposing their order, their policies to exploit their natural resources, their human resources, and largely to live at their expense. And now, our Western counterparts, when more than 50 years, well, even more than that, it's been since the decolonization was over, but it's not finalized yet, it's not completed yet, because there is a resolution of the General Assembly regarding the that there are still French colonies, British colonies that violate the decisions of the General Assembly, and we also continue to work. In this regard, we will try to make sure that the UN decisions are implemented. Unfortunately, the West did not drop its neo-colonial habits, its neo-colonial aspirations, everything that is being done now to subdue the global economy, to make it work for the interests of the West. It's a neo-colonial instincts, neo-colonial practices. These are sanctions. Many members of the G20, many developing countries were talking about as being harmful for the global economy, for food security, for energy security. And I'm talking about the attempts to manipulate the prices on the global markets. For example, introducing so-called price cap for oil is basically stealing someone else's natural resources, if we see it for what it is. Manipulating the rules of the global trade, including the norms and regulations that are still existing within the World Trade Organization, and many other things as well. Yes, we can see that the West is continuing with other ways under new conditions. They are still promoting their interests without considering the interests of the vast majority of other stakeholders of the global community, and the developing countries can see it for what it is. I have already touched upon this matter, the colossal, boorish moral pressure. Yes, some of them, when such pressure is exerted against them, they are saying certain things, or they're voting in certain manner to relieve themselves a little bit from the pressure from the United States and their allies. But almost no developing country, maybe one or two of them, made certain decisions. Almost none of them joined the sanctions against the Russian Federation, because they are perfectly aware what is going on here, what kind of game the West is playing, and They understand that it's not about Ukraine, but the thing is that our Western counterparts want to prove to them that it's still up to them to make any kind of a decision, and the threats that are now being voiced against the Chinese People's Republic. Sometimes I wonder, are they sane, these people who are posing these threats? You cannot threat to anyone, but when you threat China under current conditions, I really can't wrap my mind around it. If we speak about the manners, well, our Western counterparts have gotten really bad with this, so they are not thinking about diplomacy anymore. They are now only deal in blackmailing and threatening everyone else.
Mr. Lavrov, this is Srinjoy Chaudhary.
Excuse me, and please use the second mic for interpreters.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Lavrov, this is Srinjoy Chaudhary of Times Now Network. My question is, this war this has gone on for 1 year. If you're looking at a settlement, if you want peace, would you want India to be involved in the settlement? Do you want Prime Minister Narendra Modi to be involved in the process?
Мы имеем отношения с Индией, которые
The relations we have with India can be described as the privileged strategic partnership, and they're described as such in the documents that we have signed, and these are not just words. This formula reflects the special character of our relations, starting with India's independence and up until today. That's the nature of our relations, and we appreciate highly the responsible and worthy of a great power stance that India is taking globally on all the key matters of the global agenda. And today, when addressing the participants of the Foreign Minister meeting, President Modi, I think he presented balanced and responsible position of the country as the president of the G20. And in this address, he was not just speaking about some isolated individual situations, because the West is trying to divide the geopolitical picture into individual episodes. But in the address by Mr. Modi, he gave the assessment of the situation across the globe in general terms, and I completely share it. I think it has already been published, so you can familiarize yourselves with it. As for the assistance in resolving the crisis, on many occasions we have publicly stated that we have never refused to listen to serious suggestions that are made out of the sincere willingness to find a political resolution. One more time, I would like to remind you, when we are called to start negotiations, I do not remember anyone from the Western colleagues or from anyone else from any other countries talk to Ukraine to call them upon them to start negotiations. And I think there is a certain sad truth about this, because Ukraine is encouraged to continue war when Ukraine was ready to be engaged in negotiations last March, and when Ukraine suggested principles on how the situation could be resolved that we have supported, and we were ready to sign an agreement based on these principles. Ukraine was slapped on their wrists. Everyone knows this. The United States, the United Kingdom, a number of other actors from the European Union. And from what I understand, they told the Kyiv regime, if Russians are ready to sign an agreement on resolving the situation, it means that we need to drag it out, that we need to make them weaker to achieve the victory on the battlefield, to defeat them on the battlefield, to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. Listen to what the foreign ministers from Germany or what Josep Borrell said, the top diplomat from the European Union, no negotiations before Ukraine has advantage on the battlefield. So to call upon Russia to start negotiations, which we have never refused to have if they are in earnest, I think that's not the right thing to do. And since last March, we have not seen anything in earnest. There is only military rhetoric, belligerent decisions made in NATO, and finally, everyone seems to be forgetting, and I mean journalists as well. None of the journalists in the West and in a number of developing countries somehow does not remember that last September, Mr. Zelensky, the head of the Kyiv regime, signed a decree. And this decree forbids any kind of negotiations with the Russian government. We've been explaining this several times a day when we answer similar questions, but somehow it remains unnoticed by our colleagues from the media, from the foreign media, and they keep on asking why won't Russia agree to have negotiations. Thank you. RT Spanish. Mr. Lavrov, some Western countries think that they are doing well isolating Russia, doing the good job of it. But looking at the G20, it gives us the impression that it's some kind of fantasy. What do you think about it? And what do your Latin American counterparts think? Latin American counterparts, because you talked to your Brazilian counterpart, and I don't know if you had a chance to talk to your Argentinian and Mexican counterparts. Yes, I had a chance to talk to the Argentinian foreign minister and Mexican counterpart. Yesterday, we sat at the same table at the gala opening ceremony, and we talked with my Argentinian counterpart on the sidelines. We have cordial relations, and we've known each other for a long time, and we have very promising agenda of developing bilateral ties and economy and many other areas, and high-tech and humanitarian areas and education. I think that Latin Americans are now they have assumed the new quality in international cooperation. The crisis that the Latin American and Caribbean countries were facing some years ago, they have overcome it, and now CELAC is a group of states that are united by common goals, by common interests, to develop the region by cooperation, by collaboration. And, of course, this helps to increase the political weight of the Latin American, Caribbean nations. And I would like to draw your attention to Nicolas Maduro, Venezuelan president's initiative to build, based on this Latin American and Caribbean unity, to create a group to defend their interests more actively internationally, to create a new group, a new alliance. And I really don't understand how can you speak about the isolation of Russia when only our Western partners are talking about it. All the counterparts from the developing countries, they don't just talk to us, but they show interest to travel to us or to invite us over. And in the nearest future, we hope to travel to a number of Latin American countries. Recently, we have traveled across the African nations. And this year, we also plan to visit many other states, to have a number of foreign tours. The first channel before traveling here, Antony Blinken visited Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and it was declared openly that his goal was to separate them from Russia. That's something that he attempted to do there. How do you assess those visits by Blinken? What do you know about this visit's outcome? We have never stood against any state, any country to develop foreign ties with any other state.
Всегда подчеркивали, что
But we have always emphasized that it is not our principle to be friends with someone against someone else. And looking at how active are now not only Americans, but Europeans and British in this developing world, and especially
Содружество независимых государств
in the Commonwealth of Independent States, this is the line, this is the policy, something that you've mentioned, and they are not hiding it, that they are working against these countries having good relations with the Russian Federation. We know what kind of reasons they use. They don't have many. If I give you the gist of it,
занимайте сторону,
they say, take the winner's side. Russia is going to be defeated. So make up your minds beforehand. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this. And they say this not only to our neighbors. Recently, the foreign minister of Norway claimed that we should work with Africa to counter Russia, to oppose Russia. Well, it's a nice definition for what place the African continent has in the policies of this particular state of Norway. But once again, we always stand for every country to define their own priorities.
мы исходим из не просто из понимания,
We believe
что наши соседи, наши партнеры,
that
союзники
our neighbors, our partners, our allies, and CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union, CIS, they reaffirm in all their contexts their adherence to all the responsibilities that they have assumed in all these international organizations. Japanese newspaper Asahi, this G20 meeting, you have held talks with India, China, Brazil, and Turkey. Did you have contacts with any other countries? And do you feel that the more and more countries agree with Russia's stance, with the Russia's claims? I don't think that there are more and more. There were a lot of them since the beginning. I don't think we would be able to change the minds of our Western counterparts, and we are not trying to knock on that door. They have made a decision not to talk to us. That's their choice. But when we meet on the sidelines of various organizations, of various forums like today's, not everyone manages to turn their face away and to run by us. But once again, the developing countries, since the very beginning of this phase of the confrontation between the West and Russia around Ukraine, but
в контексте глобального
within the context of global geopolitical aspirations to dominate the world on behalf of the United States and their satellites, the growing countries, the developing countries, have never said that they don't understand our position. It can't be explained by the fact that it did not take us one day to make the decision that we had to make 4 years after coup d'etat in Ukraine in February of 2014, and after the Minsk Accords were signed in February 2015. We were explaining our position. We were explaining to our Western counterparts that they cannot go on lying forever. And they were not just lying, but they were lying about the things that they are not undermining our interests. They said the same thing about the NATO enlargement that had 5 waves of getting closer to our neighbors. The same thing happened with their agreement not to deploy new weapons on the territories of new members of NATO. And now we all see what happened to the Minsk Accords. And all these years, while the regime rose in Kyiv that came to power as a result of armed coup d'etat, they were destroying everything Russia: education, mass media, culture, like I said before. And to all our appeals to the West to make these people to at least implement their own constitution that says clearly and openly that they must ensure the rights protect the rights of Russians and other ethnic minorities, and to force them to implement the conventions that they have signed. The West did not react in any way. I do not exclude it now that a lot of our Western counterparts, they encouraged the Kyiv regime to destroy everything Russian. President Putin, some time ago, said that they are trying to create anti-Russia from Ukraine. I think it's a very good description of what's going on, and we have no doubt that they have had this idea for some time now. We talked about this meeting, the meeting of the finance ministers. They couldn't adopt the final declaration, agree on the final declaration, and in my speech I reminded my counterparts about the following fact. The G20, like I mentioned before, was established in 1999 for the finance ministers and governors of the central banks, and since 2008 there were meetings at the head of states level, and since 1999 the West has made a number of unlawful, illegitimate actions in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. Libya and Iraq are still trying to recover their statehood. Hundreds of thousands of people died, including civilians, women, and children. Entire cities were razed to the ground. Just think about Mosul in Iraq, Raqqa in Syria. The terrorist threat has grown, especially when the Libya was destroyed. And the fact that the terrorists are posing huge threats in Africa, especially in Sahel region, sub-Saharan region, mostly it's an outcome of what happened in Libya, and all the sanctions Americans were planning coming from the assumption that they have this right to resolve any matter, any issue, anywhere in the world. None of the situations that I have just mentioned did not pose any threat to the United States. On the contrary, these situations were happening tens, thousands of miles from the American shores. But over the night, they made this decision. Colin Powell showed some kind of substance at the Security Council, and the very next day they started bombing Iraq. And then Tony Blair, some years later, said, oh yes, we made a mistake. They didn't have any WMDs. Well, they didn't have any weapons, but now there is no country, basically. There are still, our Iraqi friends are trying to restore their national unity. In our case, for years we were warning, do not turn Ukraine into a threat against the Russian Federation. Not somewhere across the ocean, but right at our border, at the territories where Russians have been living for centuries, were preserving their culture, and then this culture was cancelled out by the neo-Nazi regime that came to power in Ukraine. That's why we are going to continue to fight for justice for the Ukrainian people. We will continue to stand for the interests of the Russians who live in Ukraine, and we will also provide and ensure the interests of all those people, all those regions and areas who expressed their will at the referenda to join the Russian Federation. Sputnik, please, the next question. Mr. Lavrov, you mentioned that the Western countries wanted to stop everyone from discussing the Nord Stream incident and everything else. Were there any states that supported the Russian point of view? And the second question, did you get a chance to speak about the national currency settlement with other countries, the supply chains? Is there any progress, and which countries are thinking about our initiatives in the most positive way? Well, as for the new supply chains that will be protected from the sanctions and other legitimate actions by the West and the national currency settlements, because of the malicious violations by the Americans being emitters of dollar, and they use emitters of euro, and Japanese are also abusing their power with Vienna, and we talked about this with my Chinese counterpart, with the representatives of the Brazil and Turkey. And of course, it's an essential component of our bilateral cooperation that should be protected against what the West is doing in the global economy. Everyone now sees how unreliable dollar is, and every third world country at least. I know that for a fact. Even if they don't state this publicly, a lot of them do, but even those who do not state this publicly, they start thinking about the long-term plans to make themselves safe from any kind of actions like this in the future. As for the Nord Stream, yes, we talked about adding this item to the declaration, and the China's People's Republic supported us, mostly us in China. We're trying to achieve this, and most of the developing countries from the G20 expressed their understanding and their willingness to agree to see this item in the declaration. But the West, you remember how did the West react to the investigation that was published by Seymour Hersh? Their frustrated reaction, and after this investigation was published, they started saying it's nonsense, we are not even discussing it. I think it makes everything clearer, but we will try to make this investigation happen. We will not allow them to just sweep it all under the carpet, like it happened a lot of times when the West accused us of poisoning Navalny, and Germany is still refusing to send us the results of the medical tests, which is outrageous, and the same stance the Brits took regarding the incident in Salisbury, when they did not even send us the medical documentation, but other information that we have requested officially in accordance with the requirements from the international conventions. The West does not want to react to the matters that show the true color of what they're doing. And even this incident in Bucha, the fresh example for you, in early April, right after we agreed with the Ukrainians based on their proposals to draft a document, an agreement. A couple days after that, there was an incident in Bucha. Our Western counterparts do not like to talk about. They start looking the other way right away. I would like to remind you, back last September at the UN Security Council meeting, when I was reacting to the unsubstantiated accusations, I talked about this. I said that despite of our numerous requests to receive the information about this incident, we got no response, and at the Security Council meeting, in the presence of all the ministers, I addressed the Secretary General of the UN to help me to receive the list of the individuals that were found in this Kyiv's suburb, and still we are waiting for the response. La Stampa, please.
Mr. Lavrov, what do you think about Silvio Berlusconi's position about the war, and that this may change the attitude of the Giorgia Meloni's government, the Italian government? Thank you.
Ну, знаете, мы слышим оценки и заявления многих.
You know, we hear statements and assessments of a lot of world leaders and experienced politicians, and Silvio Berlusconi is one of them. It's a reasonable person who will not try to paint everything into white and black, who will not try to impose any confrontational views under the motto of democracies fighting the autocracies. He understands the need to look for the solutions that our mutual coexistence on this planet depends upon. As for the Ukrainian crisis, I would not repeat myself, but like I said, the West is demanding from Zelensky to continue to throw more and more Ukrainian soldiers into this war waged by us, And like Zelensky himself
включая призывы тех, кто искренне хотел бы
bans any negotiations with Russia. And
в этих обстоятельствах
everything else, all the appeals to try to stop this conflict peacefully makes no sense under the current circumstances. And the final question, please.
That's okay.
Good afternoon. In the last 36 hours, you've had many bilateral meetings with several countries. How many of these nations have shown interest in trade using local currency? And if you could tell us that what would Russia would like to achieve in terms of managing and expanding local currency trade with different countries you've had meetings with? Thank you.
все наши партнеры не только
All our partners, not only those we've met here, but also those we are in contact with under different circumstances when we visit their countries, when they visit our country. With no exception, all of them are interested in expanding the use of the national currencies
в нашей взаимной торговле
in our mutual trade.
со всеми странами БРИКС,
More than that, with all the BRICS countries, India, Brazil, South African Republic,
Китайская Народная Республика,
China,
мы уже внедряем
we are already implementing for quite some time now. We are introducing this method of using national currencies in our mutual settlements, and the share of national currencies is growing consistently, and that's how it is going to be.
Кстати, ваше
And I would like to draw your attention to the following fact. President Lula,
вскоре после инаугурации
soon after he was inaugurated,
программных речей
in one of his speeches, I think it was during the summit with President Fernandez from Argentina,
чтобы в рамках СИЛАК не просто
he said that within CELAC they should not just turn to the national currency settlements, but to develop the ground, the foundation to have their South American currency. And the debates about thinking about something like that,
и в рамках БРИКС.
we also have similar ideas within BRICS as well.
Hindu, please.
Все?
No, we have two more questions.
Hi, good afternoon, Excellency. This is Lol from the Hindu. In the Bangalore meeting of the finance ministers and the central bank governors of G20, the outcome document basically called out on Russia and asked Russia to withdraw from Ukraine unconditionally. And it cited the Bali statement on that. So, what is your response to those who call on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine unconditionally?
Я хотел бы узнать, вы здесь с самого начала находитесь?
I would like to ask you, are you here with us since the very beginning?
Not really, Excellency. Please forgive me for that.
Нет, вы здесь с самого начала пресс-конференции?
Have you been here from the beginning of the press conference?
Нет?
I came midway.
Вы тогда опоздали, к сожалению. Я
Then,
из уважения к тем,
since
кто
you're
пришел
late,
вовремя,
out of
и слава
respect
Богу,
to those who came on time, I would not be able to give you a detailed answer. But as for the document
встречи министров финансов
that
и глав
was
Центральных банков,
adopted after the meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors, it was not adopted, so it's hard for me to somehow react to this part of your question.
Mr. Lavrov, I have two related questions. I'm Sadek. Most G20 countries seem to be opposed to the Russian intervention in Ukraine. Many of them, aside from China and India, were supported the UN resolution condemning Russia's intervention. Do you feel isolated?
Вы тоже опоздали, что ли? Я не понял.
Were you the one who's late as well? Were you late as well? No, we do not feel isolated, especially
Двадцатки и тем
in
более,
the
когда
G20 events, and especially when we hold summits and ministerial meetings within BRICS, SCO,
встречаемся
when we
с
meet
странами-членами Лиги арабских
with
государств,
Arab League nations, with the African Union nations, with our Latin American friends, we do not feel isolated. You know, the West is isolating themselves now,
осознание скоро придет.
and soon this understanding will come to them. And the developing countries, they can see
Про необходимость
all
быть
these
против автократии. Если
words about the democracy fighting against autocracy worth.
пытается всех
If the West is so democratic, they are trying to convince everyone of, why can't you apply democratic principles internationally? So, an event happened, something that we've been talking for years, that it was inevitable if no security guarantees are adopted that would include the Russian Federation, but the entire European continent as well. We were not heard, we were not listened to, we were told it's none of your business, how do we expand NATO? And then President Putin gave a very detailed explanation, he explained the situation, and he declared that we have to, there is no other way for us but to start the special military operation. The entire West has condemned us, and the other countries, the developing countries, they have not expressed their position back then. And if the West, they're so democratic, so then allow everyone else to make up their minds. Who's got more reasons, more arguments, Russia or the West? That's what we do. We just explained our position, and that was it. The West, the United States of America, and the leaders of NATO and the EU, they travel around the world, and they demand everyone to condemn Russia. Is this democracy? Is that a respect for the right of every country to make their own decisions? The UN Charter states that the UN is based on the sovereign equality of the states. The West has never respected this principle. And they continue their illegitimate attacks against everyone and everything, and it's quite interesting to see what arguments they use. A lot of my friends were telling me from the developing countries, so what do they promise you? So, okay, you condemned Russia, what do you get instead? And they said, we are asking them what we will get in response. Do you know what the answer is? We will not punish you. That's the equal exchange. Just fulfill my ultimatum or you will be punished. That's not how we work. That's how our Western counterparts work, to my deepest regret. And all these constant mentioned G20 and Bali, where you were condemned, these condemned you, those condemned you. I have already said that the G20 has been established in 1999. And all those things that the West has done in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, and Libya, and in Syria, and in Afghanistan, by and large, it has been going on for years, and we still feel the consequences. There is more terrorist threat, there is more drug trafficking. If we look at Afghanistan, where NATO in 20 years, they were basically defeated there. So they absolutely failed. It was a complete failure. And the supply chains, the markets there are disrupted. But not a single meeting of the G20 group since it was established in 1999 never mentioned, not a single country mentioned about any of these crises or conflicts. As if no one cared about this, while hundreds of thousands are dying in Africa, in Arabic countries, in Afghanistan. G20 are only doing what they are supposed to do. And here, when the West did not succeed in the efforts that they were planning to, now the West is forcing everyone to speak only about this. So that's not the right way to work. Thank you very much.